Hello, friends and listeners. We are proud to present one of Rex Academy's own advisors and today's guest, Mr. Carl Hooker. Mr. Hooker has 22 plus years of experience in education as a teacher and administrator. He has launched and maintained EdTech initiatives that have received national acclaim. He's written for national publications including EdSurge, Huffington Post, Tech and Learning, and Edutopia. He's the host of two podcasts, ISTE's Learning Unleashed and Future Ready Schools UnDisrupted, which have both received 5-star ratings on iTunes. His blog, HookEd on Innovation, receives over 1,000 hits daily from all over the globe. Carl has been an advisor and influencer to multiple products and companies since 2014. Most notable are Kahoot, Nearpod, Catch-On, and Netref. His role with these companies varied based on the scope of work. He's currently the Chief Evangelist for Trashboards and an advisor for Bulb and Chief Evangelist of Innovation at Rex. Mr. Hooker, welcome. We are so excited to have you on our show. Let's talk computer science.
All right. Thank you so much for having me, Sandy. I love it. Love the podcast. Love, of course, Rex. So let's get into this.
So why did you choose to become a teacher?
So a funny story. I started out as an engineer. I was doing architectural engineering, and my mom had been a teacher for a long time, and I have a lot of educators in my family. And at some point, I was going to the University of Texas here in Austin, and midway through my career, I guess as a student, I looked at I just felt like engineering was too black and white. I liked a lot of the science behind it and the computer science behind it. But I really wanted to get in front of people and interact with people. So I changed majors to the most opposite thing I could think of, which was drama. So I actually went into drama for a while. So I was doing acting and radio work and things like that. And I thought, part of me thinks I wasted that part of my college career, but I've used it so much now as a teacher and as like someone who provides professional learning. So I switched finally at the end to become an elementary educator, and then went back to the University of North Texas to get my master's degree in computer science and cognitive systems. So educational technology, as it is now, is what they call it today. But I was partially motivated by my parents and my upbringing, but partially is because I just really enjoyed seeing the excitement in kids when they learn something, and then later adults as well. When those light bulb moments happen from any age, from 8 to 80, I think it's still a good thing to see, and it brings me joy. It's worth more than any dollar amount I could ever get.
Yep, yes, totally agree. And I'm sure the drama helped you with your keynote speaking, stage presence, right?
Right. I mean, having to read Green Eggs and Ham in 27 different voices, that was my final project. So I had to create 27 different voices to do that. And my kids love it now because my daughters get to hear all the voices whenever I read to them at night. But I'll use some of them sometimes with podcasts. And of course, on stage, you're right. You have to have a certain amount of presence and kind of waiting for, those moments when you deliver a line, or whether it's a comedy routine, waiting for the audience to kind of react to that too. So I think that's a big part of it. And it did help. It has helped, I guess, in my speaking career for sure.
Mm-hmm. So please tell us more about your personal consulting roles and on the different companies that you work with, and anything related to EdTech and career endeavors, and how you're moving the education needle forward.
Yeah. So in 2019, I read a book that I probably shouldn't have read. It was called Leap, and it was about taking a leap of faith and just totally quitting your job and just doing something not completely different, but just kind of falling into something else, not necessarily with a plan. So I decided to leave my job as a district administrator here in Austin and become a full-time consultant public speaker, with the intent of also doing some other work, like working with companies, EdTech startups, working with Future Ready Schools, who I have a podcast with, as they do more national policy. And so really figuring out ways that I can move the needle even more with education versus just the students in my district at the time. So I wanted to have a little more impact on a national level. So it was quite a risk, and it started out great until COVID hit, and then all the public speaking just disappeared right off the planet, and all of a sudden it had to be virtual speaking, which was a little bit different. And so my 5-year plan changed to a 5-month plan, and I started looking into influencing work, which is something I'd been interested in. Working with a mutual colleague, Jacob, who we know, doing some of that work with him, and really kind of using my network of friends and influencers and educational experts, and just saying, what can we do right now? And giving them work too was another part of it, because they were also losing work. So figuring out a way to help them out, as well as pushing forward with programs and products that we believe in, that we believe are helping education, like Rex Academy. So tying to those products was a big part of it. So I feel like in my mind, part of it was, of course, financial. You want to be able to make enough money for your family to survive. But the other part of it was like, let's see what kind of movement we can really make in education. What kind of disruption can we cause? And so that's kind of my guiding star, so to speak. That's what I'm still about, is like, I want to find those companies, those products, and those people that are willing to move education forward. And now is the time, because we are at that moment of disruption right now with COVID.
Yep, totally agree. Education will be very different after COVID. I mean, it's very different now.
Yeah.
It's somewhere in between how it is now versus how it was before.
Right.
So what do you think about, I'm switching gears to computer science now. So what do you think about the current state of computer science K-12 education system in US?
Well, so to tie back into what I just said too about pushing the needle and moving and changing, I think one of the things that drew me to your company was that it was innovative, and it is disruptive, and it is innovative, and it is changing some of the things that needed to happen with computer science. Because what I saw, even in a very innovative high school where I worked at, what I saw in terms of curriculum was still very much the old model of open up this 300-page manual, go to page 321 or whatever it is, and complete the task and the series of things on Microsoft Access 2000. And this is from 2016. So, I mean, it wasn't like, Microsoft Access 2000 has been out for 16 years at that point. And I'm like, this is the computer science curriculum we're offering, you know? And there were some inklings of app design and app development, which I thought was good, but it needed to be reinvigorated. And some of it, and one of the problems that I saw, and one of the problems that I see that you guys solve at Rex, was that there just wasn't enough teachers to really do it. And so what you're left with is you get kind of the leftover teachers, or the teachers that are sort of interested in computer science, or in some worst cases, it's the teacher that has maybe an open period that's like, I'm teaching 3 math classes and a history class, and now just, okay, can you do this computer science class? So they really have no idea kind of what they're doing. They're maybe open to it, but they don't have the background in it. So one of the things I liked about Rex was that idea that you don't have to have that background. And I felt like that's the big barrier that we need to overcome. And Rex Academy provides that barrier. I know this isn't just an ad for Rex, but that's what I'm just telling you. That's why I was attracted to the company, because I thought this is going to solve that problem that I see. It just keeps getting wider too. And I feel like we're not turning out enough students in the US on the comp sci side of things. Those jobs are going to more international markets. And I think we need to do a better job of that here in the US.
Yep, totally agree. So what do you feel are typical challenges that are faced by teachers or schools that want to implement more CS courses, or who are already teaching CS courses?
Well, so your funding is a big one too. Besides the idea that teachers don't have the training or the capacity sometimes to do some of the comp sci courses, you've also got a funding issue, because here in Texas, at least, a lot of the money that is allocated for curriculum goes towards usually the big textbook companies, the Pearsons of the world, and they all that money is snatched up for math and in English language arts and foreign languages and social studies and science. So what ends up being left over is kind of like, okay, this goes toward electives, and they get maybe the leftover stuff. So I feel like the bigger barrier that teachers and leaders need to overcome is that idea that computer science isn't just a one-off class. It needs to be part of the mainstream. So that's part of the movement I think that needs to happen in this country and going forward. Because I think when you start talking about machine learning and artificial intelligence and where we're headed as a society, that's going to mimic or mirror what we need to be doing in schools. The problem is schools are always 5 to 10 to 20 years behind, depending on where you are in the world. And we're behind on it already. So what can we do to kind of pivot on that? So again, going back to your question about those challenges, I think one of it is just the training idea, like what's the the knowledge base of the teachers that we have existing in our systems. Two is that funding idea, like where are we putting our dollars? And I think, is there enough money going towards computer science and going towards STEM or STEAM? And it's starting to pick up, but I still think we're woefully behind on that in terms of where we need to be in the future.
Yeah, and like earlier I was talking to the CS for All founder, right? And she brought up a really interesting point about how we have decentralized education system. So
Right.
every state is pretty much on its own. So that's also creates some challenges for the
Right.
country.
So every state has their own metric of how they're doing things. Every state has their own way of funding sources and what they consider important based on their state or local leadership. And then in some states, it's even more decentralized. So now it's just local. We're like, you can do whatever you want at the local level. So now you're really talking about, I understand some of the ideas and the attraction of decentralized in general, but there needs to be at least some standards or some at least basic things that we're pushing forward with all of our schools as a country to continue to kind of stay at the forefront. Otherwise, we'll continue to fall behind.
Do you think CS education should be taught like to K-12 students? And at what age should we start teaching CS?
So I've seen a lot of innovation in this space recently. I think, first of all, I think you may not start the Python coding with the kindergarten right away, but I think you could lay some of the groundwork for that. There's a company, I can't remember, I think it's called Kinder Labs now, that does a thing where it's block coding, but with actual physical blocks, where kids are actually moving little physical blocks with their hands, manipulatives, kind of getting the basics down of what coding would be like, and then moving that up to like a Scratch Junior, Scratch, of course, which is embedded in the Rex Academy curriculum. And having that ability, I think, is an important thing. So for me, I think it starts as early as elementary. One of the things that school districts around the country push for is a big trend. It's still around, even though it started in the 70s, but it's this whole idea of bilingual curriculum or language immersion, where you have students taking both Spanish and English at the same time. I've only seen a couple schools try this, but there are some schools, one in California that did it, where they did a language immersion, but where the second language was coding. And so they're teaching the kids at an early age not only the basics of English, but also how to code and program, because it is its own language. And of course, when they're younger, their brains are a lot more pliable. They have a lot more brain plasticity, so they can actually learn those things quicker than adults or as they get older. So I think you start at an early age. Of course, you always want to monitor screen time and making sure kids aren't just on their screens all the time. So anything you can do with manipulatives and robotics to kind of tie into that too at the earlier ages, I think would be key. Kind of going forward with an elementary program. And then, of course, when they get to middle school and high school, you can kind of let them not necessarily go free, but you want to expand and challenge them with their creativity. So giving them prompts and things where they can hack each other, figure out ways to create different things that maybe hasn't been created before, because they really want to create things. And you see the environment we have with social media right now with TikTok and Snapchat and everything. They want to create something to go viral, right? So giving them an idea of how they can do that or what happens behind that virility, I think is an important thing too.
So what do you think are the benefits of teaching computer science to K-12 students? I mean, I know there's a direct benefit of learning computer science, general benefits.
I think the big thing for teaching them is that our job as educators is to prepare kids for their future, not our past. And so by giving them the skills, by teaching them those skills of computer science, we're enabling them or empowering them for the future. I don't think every kid needs to be a coder, but I do think that every kid needs to have some exposure to coding, because at some point in their career, whether they work in HR or marketing, they're going to have to know at least some of the basics of the backgrounds of code, whatever that is, and how that works. So we need to make sure that as a society and our public schools especially, we need to be making sure that kids have some exposure, even if it's just a one-time elective, a semester elective, some sort of exposure to a basic coding program, a basic coding curriculum, because I think it's giving them the tools they need to go forward in society, much like in the 1950s when we decided that everybody needed to have math, English language arts, social studies, and science. I think now in the 2020s, we need to be thinking about 70 years later, how do we reinvigorate those fields and include things like entrepreneurialism and computer science? I mean, those are things that our kids need to have going forward, and those are skills they're going to use in life later after they leave our institutions.
Yep, I love it. I think we can quote this, what you said. Our job is to enable our kids for future, not our past. If you have a magic wand to help enhance computer science in the K-12 education system, what would it do?
Short of the Matrix, where I could have every kid kind of plug in something and download it to their head, which we don't want to do necessarily. I think for me, I think the big thing is, well, there's two things. One is making sure that every kid has some sort of equitable access to technology it has to be done before we even really get into the computer science part of it, obviously, because we can't really do all that coding and programming without that. And that's being taken on now as a challenge. But once that's overcome, I think the second big challenge and the second thing that we need to use to enhance comp sci and computer science curriculum with our kids is really start targeting why is it that there is kind of a flight of girls from the industry? Like, why is it that in middle school, girls tend to turn off from computer science and it just becomes a boys' field? I mean, obviously you're an exception, and there's some other exceptions out there that you've interviewed. And I know we have National Women's Month coming up. And so thinking about, and as a father of 3 girls, I want to know, like, why is it that when they get to middle school or high school, they just feel like they can no longer do that? I feel like that's a big challenge I need to overcome. So some of the things, the early kind of ideas in this space are doing coding camps or robotics camps where there are only females involved. So there's not that kind of pressure to feel like they have to be different than the boys and things like that. That's one way around it. I do think that's an idea. It may not be the perfect solution, because I think essentially we need to show girls why is it as important for them as it is for boys. And I just think right now, maybe as society, we need to change kind of our concepts of what that looks like. And that's a huge thing to overcome. And that's more than just what we can do in schools. But what we can do in schools for that magic pill is, like, at least offer it and say, here's a chance for you to try it, have everybody try it out at an early age, and then decide if they really want to go forward with it. And if they do want to go forward with it, give them more and more opportunities, whether it be during school, after school, or in summer, to explore that creativity and talk about all the creative elements that come along with the computer science. Because I think the problem isn't the kids, it's the adults. And sometimes we think these buildings exist for the adults, but the buildings actually exist for kids. And so we make rules and regulations based on our perceived notions. I'll give you a quick example. And it was a career day thing for 5th graders. Counselor invited me in, and I was substituting, kind of helping out a little bit. And she started going through all the jobs. Like, here are the 12 different jobs that you might be interested in. You could be a fireman. You could, the kind of the typical stuff. And then one of them was computer science. And I leaned in and I was like, okay, what's she going to say? And she's like, and then some kid goes, what's computer science? I was like, oh, this is amazing. What a great opportunity. And she goes, it's like the people that fix computers. And then she kept going. And so when she asked them all, like, were they interested in, not a single kid raised their hand. And so I stopped. And I said, wait a minute, I have to interrupt. And I go, I apologize. I'm just going to interrupt. I don't want to be that dad, but here we go. I go, guys, have you ever played a video game before? Have you ever actually seen an app on a phone and been like, wow, that's really cool. I wonder how they did that. And they're all like, yeah. And I was like, how do you think that stuff gets created? And they're like, what do I? And I was like, computer science. And they're like, whoa. And then when she asked them again, like, more than half the class raised their hand, like, we want to be in computer science. But she had no idea. And so she was passing along kind of a preconceived notion of what that was. So it does start with us in a lot of ways, because we're limiting some of what kids can do based on our own kind of lack of knowledge. So I think, it's a twofold project. You want to make sure kids have exposure to it, but we also need to make sure that the adults also are aware of the power and potential of what it can provide to our students.
Totally agree. Like, I have few examples similar. Like, it's the girls issue we can only fix with parents, everyone. It has to be like everyone. Totally agree. So I have one more question. Can you describe the ideal solution so that every kid in the US learns computer science in K-12? What would be the ideal solution if there are no bounds, no system restrictions in any way?
Yeah, if we assume that every kid has access and every kid has a device, and so let's go forward with that assumption. It would have to be, some sort of web-based solution. It's got to be pretty nimble, meaning it doesn't take up a ton of bandwidth, because, internet connectivity being what it is. Of course, you just said no restrictions, but I'm already thinking, like, there's some areas where it's going to be hard to get internet. So having both an online and an offline version of it, I think, is an interesting idea. So having the online version where you could do it on the browser, but then if it's maybe you lose connectivity, you could still do some work on it on an offline basis. And then I would say, because the other limits we talked about earlier in the podcast was that, maybe it's the teacher or the curriculum. So I would say the next part of it would be having it to where it's available to everyone on a self-paced basis, where they can go through the course and go through the modules themselves and teach themselves if they don't have access to a teacher that wants to put them through it. So having self-paced would be great. And then I guess the last thing would be, you want to have some sort of engagement or a draw. So, I mean, it's one thing to have the curriculum and have it freely available, but it's like, why do they want to do it? So you have to solve problems and say, this is going to help you with X, Y, and Z. So what are the next steps after they've done the curriculum and after they've gone through all this stuff? Is there a job market, or is there a workplace development or some sort of workplace that they can get into with a certification that'll help them kind of go on further and say, like, now these are the types of things you can do. So start with kind of the end in mind and get them to lean in and like, oh, I want to be able to design a video game. Awesome. We've got curriculum for you. And it doesn't cost anything, or it's free-ish, or it's web-based, those kind of things. So whenever you can overcome those hurdles, that's when it becomes kind of, I think, a perfect world scenario. But obviously things take time and money to do. But I think for me, that's remove as many barriers as you can and just let kids be able to just click, log in, and then go to work and code.
Yep. Yeah, it sounds great. Yes, it takes time, but I think that's what we need.
For sure.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your time, Carl. I really thoroughly enjoyed talking to you, and I have learned quite a bit. Thank you so much, and I'm sure our audience would also feel the same way. Anything else that you'd like to add?
No, thank you guys. Thank you so much for having me. And if you're interested in more of my information about me, as Sandy mentioned, I have a blog, hookedoninnovation.com. Also Twitter @Mr. Hooker. If you have any questions or want to DM me, my DMs are open.